Think about the last time someone told you that you were wrong. Not with concern, not with the careful words of a friend who genuinely worried for you, but with that particular quiet certainty that leaves no opening. The kind that comes from people who have already decided, who have looked at the evidence before them and reached their verdict, and simply need to inform you of it before getting back to their lives. Most people fold under that. They adjust their course. They find a way to believe that the consensus is wisdom, that the majority voice carries some truth inside it, that maybe the crowd knows something they don't. It is easier. It is often safer. And out on the Dakota prairie, in the autumn of 1886, where safety was a kind of religion, where the community's approval could mean the difference between a neighbor who helped you pull a wagon from the mud and a neighbor who let you struggle alone, folding was not weakness. It was arithmetic. But every now and then, not often, maybe once in a generation, someone does not fold. Someone picks up a spade instead. And what happens next rewrites everything we thought we understood about who survives when the world turns brutal and who does not. Her name was Elsa Brandt. She was 29 years old in the autumn of 1886, a widow with 2 daughters and 160 acres of short grass prairie 12 miles east of Huron in the Dakota Territory. And she was about to do something that every person who knew her would spend the next several months interpreting as the behavior of a woman who had quietly given up. They were wrong. They were wrong in a way that would cost some of them everything they thought they knew about the earth beneath their feet. And they were wrong in a way that by the time January arrived and the sky delivered its verdict would prove the difference between families that survived intact and families that did not. This is her story. The Dakota Territory in the autumn of 1886 was not a place that forgave errors in judgment. It never had been. The land itself flat and enormous and swept by winds that no eastern newspaper had ever accurately described. Winds that came in off the northern plains with a kind of indifferent efficiency, as though the prairie was simply clearing its throat, was not hostile exactly. Hostility implies intent. The land had no intent. It simply was what it was, a place of staggering beauty in June, and a place of staggering lethality in February, and a place that drew a sharp and unmerciful line between the people who understood that difference in their bones and the people who had only read about it. The families who had come here beginning in the late 1870s, drawn by land grants and the peculiar optimism that open space seems to produce in the human imagination, had arrived carrying trunks and Bibles and the deep portable faith that honest labor was its own guarantee. They built frame houses on the open prairie, the same frame houses they would have built in Ohio or Pennsylvania or Indiana, because those were the houses they knew how to build, because the lumber could be hauled in by rail from the east, because a man standing on his own land naturally wanted to build something visible, something that announced his presence to the sky and to his neighbors, something that said, I am here, I intend to remain. And I have enough faith in that intention to put wood above my family's heads. What those houses could not do, what no structure built above the surface of the ground, and open to the full force of a Dakota winter on 3 sides could reliably do, was hold its warmth against a sustained blizzard at temperatures that dropped past 20 below zero, while the wind stripped whatever heat the walls managed to generate and flung it north into the dark. A well-built frame house with a tight roof and banked earth around the foundation could keep a family alive through most of what the territory offered. It could not keep them warm. There was a difference between those two things, and it was a difference that the older residents had learned to measure, not in degrees but in firewood, in the way a stack of split hardwood could disappear in a brutal week, in the specific arithmetic of warmth and wood, and how long the one could sustain the other when the other was being eaten alive by cold. The community that had grown up around those frame houses, the Holts to the west, the Lindqvists to the north, Pastor Reinhardt's small Lutheran congregation 4 miles up the road, the Brennan family to the south, operated according to an unspoken set of agreements that were less social convention than survival mechanism. You helped your neighbor with the harvest because your neighbor would help you with yours. You shared what you had in a bad season because in a bad season what you had might be what stood between another family and catastrophe. You listened to what the experienced farmers said about the weather about the soil, about what had worked and what had failed, because their experience was the closest thing to reliable knowledge that existed out here 40 miles from the nearest physician, in a place where the roads disappeared under a 6-foot drift in under 2 hours. And when the community reached a consensus, when the collective weight of opinion settled on a course of action and pointed in a direction, you followed it. Not because you were required to, because in a landscape that offered so little margin for error, the community's consensus was the nearest thing to a safety net that existed. Deviate from it, and you were not just making an individual choice. You were signaling that you did not trust the accumulated wisdom of the people around you. And in a place where that wisdom might be the only thing standing between your children and a January night at 40 below, that signal carried weight. Elsa Brandt had understood this for 7 years. She had understood it since the moment she and her husband Heinrich arrived in the territory in 1879 with $200, a carpenter's toolkit, and the specific species of optimism that the land grant pamphlets had been carefully designed to cultivate. She had understood the arithmetic of community, had participated in it fully and willingly, had brought food to sick neighbors and helped Dorothy Holt put up preserves in September, and sat in Pastor Reinhardt's spare wooden church on Sunday mornings and listened to the hymns rise into the cold rafters. She was not separate from the community. She had built herself into it carefully, as though into a structure she knew she would need. And then Heinrich died in April of 1886, and the community she had built herself into turned, with the kindest possible intentions, into a thing that wanted to send her away. He died in 11 days, pneumonia moving fast through a body that had been weakened by a winter that had been harder than the almanac predicted, and a spring planting season that had required more from him than either of them had understood at the time. On the third day, he was coughing and pale and dismissive, the way men who work with their hands often are about their own bodies, treating illness as a scheduling inconvenience rather than a threat. On the 6th day, he could no longer get out of bed. On the 9th day, he stopped recognizing her face. She sat beside him on the last 2 days and held his hand. And she did what she had always done when the ground shifted under her. She calculated. Not because she was cold, not because her grief was not real or not large, but because calculation was the tool her mind reached for. When fear moved in, and in those hours beside Heinrich's bed, fear was very large and very close, and the calculation her mind produced was this one woman. 2 daughters ages 5 and 8, 160 acres, one approaching winter. The numbers did not add up in any direction she turned them. She knew this before he took his last breath. At the funeral, the community came. They brought food and kind faces and the specific solemnity that small communities produce when one of their own is put into the ground. Thomas Holt and his son Nathan carried the casket. Pastor Reinhardt spoke carefully and warmly about a man he had known for 7 years as a reliable neighbor and an honest worker. Carl Lindqvist stood in the back with his hat against his chest, not speaking, as was his way, but present, which was what mattered. The widow Brennan brought a pie and cried more openly than Elsa did not seem to find anything strange about this. And then the community went home, and in the weeks that followed, with an inevitability that had nothing cruel in it, the consensus formed. It formed the way consensus always forms in small communities, facing a practical problem. Not through any single conversation, not through any explicit decision, but through the slow accumulation of quiet agreements between people who trusted each other's judgment. The practical problem was straightforward. A woman alone, no male labor. 2 small children, 160 acres, and the approaching winter of 1886, which every farmer in the territory could feel in the quality of the August air, in the way the grasshoppers had vanished early in the particular lean dryness of the late summer soil. It was going to be hard. The smart money and the neighborly instinct said the same thing. Elsa Brandt should sell the claim, take whatever she could get for the equipment and the livestock, and go east to whatever family might take her in. It was not a cruel conclusion. It was a reasonable one. The territory did not survive on sentiment. It survived on clear-eyed assessment of resources and odds. And the clear-eyed assessment of Elsa's situation produced a clear result. Thomas Holt was the first to come. He arrived on a Saturday morning in early June, 6 weeks after Heinrich's burial, on the pretext of checking whether the north fence line needed repair after the spring thaw. He was a large man. Thomas Holt broad through the shoulders in the way of men who had been doing heavy work since childhood, with a face that had been reddened and creased by 15 Dakota winters into something that looked permanently skeptical even when he was being kind. He checked the fence, found 2 posts that needed resetting, reset them without being asked, and then stood at the edge of the property with his hat in both hands. He told her about a merchant in Huron. A man named Garfield, he said, who had been buying out claims for the past 2 seasons, paying fair prices for the equipment and taking on the mortgages clean. Garfield had expressed interest in the Brandt property specifically. The land was good land, the well was sound. Garfield would give her enough to live comfortably for 2 or 3 years back east, maybe with her sister-in-law in Wisconsin, if she had no one closer long enough to get her feet under her. He said it with genuine care. He was not selling anything. He was not looking to benefit from her decision in any way she could identify. He was a man who had watched a neighbor die and was now trying to ensure the neighbor's widow did not follow him into the ground before Christmas. Elsa thanked him. She offered him coffee. They sat on the porch for 20 minutes talking about the fence and the wheat and whether the summer would bring enough rain. And when Thomas Holt rode back west, she stood and watched him go, and felt something settle into place in her chest that she had not expected to feel resolve. Not the brittle resolve of someone who has made a desperate decision. The quiet, dense resolve of someone who has just been handed the exact confirmation they needed, that the thing they were already planning to do was necessary. She had not told Thomas Holt that she was already planning something. She had not told anyone. She had not told Heinrich in the years when telling him would have been natural. Because Heinrich was a man who trusted what he could see and touch and measure, and what Elsa knew what she carried inside her, as both technical knowledge and something closer to faith, was not the kind of thing that looked like anything from the outside. It looked from the outside like a woman who thought about winter too much. It looked like anxiety. It looked like the particular strain of worry that comes from having grown up close to someone who worried about winter, who talked about winter with a specificity and seriousness that the people around her tended to find excessive. That person was her grandmother, Astrid Halvorson. Astrid had been born in 1821 in the northern reaches of Minnesota, the daughter of Scandinavian settlers who had arrived in America with very little except the knowledge of what a serious winter looked like and how to build against it. Her parents had constructed their first home in Minnesota, the way their families had built for generations in cold climates, not as a structure placed on top of the land, but as a structure built with the land using the earth itself as the primary material and the primary insulator. They dug into a south-facing hillside. They built their walls from the dense sod of the Minnesota prairie. They put the ground to work. Astrid grew up in those structures. She learned what they could do, not as theory, but as lived experience, the difference between sleeping in a room where the walls were packed, earth 6 feet deep, and sleeping in a room where the walls were 3 inches of lumber and nothing else. The difference in how a fire behaved, how long the warmth lasted after the fire went low, how the cold moved or did not move through materials of different densities. She married and built above ground eventually, as most people did, because above ground construction was what her neighbors understood and what her husband preferred. But she never forgot what the earth could do. And in the long summer evenings of Elsa's childhood, when the family came to visit Astrid's farm in Minnesota, the old woman talked. Elsa was 12 the summer. Astrid sat with her in the kitchen after supper and unfolded a piece of brown paper, the back of a flour sack flattened and smoothed, and began to draw. She drew the way a person draws who is trying to transfer something that matters, who understands that the drawing is not the point, but the understanding is the point. And the drawing is just the bridge between one person's knowing and another person's knowing. She drew a cross-section of the earth. She drew how the temperature changed with depth. At the surface, violent, unpredictable, following the air. At 3 feet, calmer. At 6 feet, she drew a horizontal line and beside it wrote in her small, careful hand, 45 to 55 degrees all year, no matter what the sky does. She explained it the way a farmer explains things in terms of what it means rather than what it is. The earth absorbed heat from the summer sun the way a stone absorbs heat from a fire, slowly, steadily storing it deep. And then in winter, when the surface grew cold, the earth gave that stored heat back slowly, steadily from the inside out. The ground at 6 feet deep did not freeze in a Dakota winter. It stayed within its narrow range, indifferent to blizzards, indifferent to wind chills, indifferent to whatever the sky chose to do. It was not warm by any comfortable measure, but it was survivable, and in the northern plains, survivable and dead were not points on the same scale. They were different universes. What Astrid taught was not just the principle. It was the application, how to read a slope for drainage, so the water moved away from your structure instead of into it. How to orient your entrance to put the dominant northwest wind behind you. How to build a short tunnel entrance that cooled incoming air before it reached your living space, so every time the door opened, you did not lose the hour of warmth you had just built. How to lay your floor in stone rather than earth, because stone held heat more efficiently and prevented capillary moisture from wicking up through the soil. How to place your stovepipe so that as much of it as possible ran through insulated material rather than open air, because every inch of pipe in the warm zone was an inch that kept its heat in the room rather than venting it to the sky. She talked for 3 hours that evening, drawing and annotating and correcting the drawings and drawing again. She called it building with the ground. She said it had kept people alive for a very long time in places where the winter was serious enough to mean it. Elsa was 12. She sat and listened and remembered. She remembered not because she had any particular plan at the time, not because she was a strange or especially serious child, but because something in the quality of Astrid's attention. The focused, unhurried intensity of a person who understood that what they were passing on mattered, made the information feel like it belonged in a specific place in her mind, where things of importance were kept. She did not think about it again for years. Then she moved to the Dakota Territory and met her first real winter, and she thought about it a great deal. The winter of 1885 had been the one that clarified things. Not the worst winter the territory had ever seen, not by any experience measure, but bad enough. 3 weeks in January where the temperature did not rise above -10 degrees, where the firewood went faster than either of them had calculated, where she lay awake at night in the frame house, listening to the wind work at the walls, and thought with increasing precision about what happened to families in houses like this, when the wood ran out before the cold did. Heinrich had been dismissive in the way that competent men can be dismissive about threats they have not yet faced. He had managed every previous winter. He had built the house with good lumber and good technique, and the house had held. The house had held because they had enough wood and enough luck, and because the cold in 1885, though serious, was not what the territory was capable of producing. He did not want to hear about underground structures. He listened once politely when she tried to explain what Astrid had drawn on the flour sack. And then he said that he had talked to Thomas Holt. And Thomas Holt said the Swanson family 3 miles north had built something like that 10 years ago and abandoned it after one winter, because the water came in. He said it the way Heinrich always said things he had decided, not unkindly, but finally. The conversation ended. Elsa went back to the kitchen, and the subject did not come up again. She had accepted this. She had accepted it partly because Heinrich was not wrong, that water management was a genuine challenge, and partly because she understood that in a marriage, as in a community, there were negotiated limits on how far one person's private certainty could push against another person's reasonable objection. She had filed the knowledge away and lived with the anxiety and told herself that as long as they were careful with the firewood, and as long as the winters did not get worse, they would be all right. Then Heinrich died, and she did not have to negotiate with anyone anymore. This was the thing she had not expected to feel in the days after his death, not freedom. Nothing as clean or morally comfortable as that, but a specific, unencumbered clarity about what needed to happen next. She grieved. The grief was real, and it was large, and it came in waves at unexpected moments. When she found his hammer on the workbench when May asked where Papa was, and she had to answer the question for the fourth time when she sat down to work the accounts, and there was only one column where there had always been two. She did not minimize the grief or rush past it. But inside the grief and alongside it, and in certain quiet hours completely separate from it, the calculation continued. One woman, two daughters, 160 acres, one approaching winter. And now, for the first time since she had sat in Astrid's kitchen at the age of 12, no one to tell her the house would be enough. She spent the summer of 1886 doing two things simultaneously: running the farm well enough to keep it and planning the structure she had carried in her memory for 17 years. The planning was meticulous in a way that Heinrich would have recognized and respected had he been alive to see it. She worked from Astrid's drawings, which she no longer had on paper, but which lived in her memory with the specific clarity that important information acquires when it is received from someone whose urgency about it communicates itself clearly. She adapted the design to her specific land, no hill, which meant she needed to create her drainage advantage through site selection rather than natural topography. A slight natural rise 40 yards north of the house, less than 4 feet of elevation over 20 yards, but enough. She oriented the plan to use that rise as drainage and to put the entrance facing southeast. She calculated her material requirements with the almanac open beside her at the kitchen table after the girls were asleep. The sod blocks, roughly 1,800 of them, 18 inches by 10 inches, cut from the excavated earth and the surface sod around it. The stone for the floor available at the dry creek bed a quarter-mile east, requiring approximately 40 wheelbarrow loads. The roof poles, cottonwood available from the stand along the creek, needing to be cut and hauled. The tar paper available at the hardware in Huron, price inquiry needed. The stove, she knew where to get one. The firewood calculation was the one she returned to most often. 3 cords, she decided. In the frame house, 3 cords was 30 days of hard winter. In a properly built earth-sheltered structure, the same 3 cords would give her 60 days, maybe more, depending on how cold it got and how well the thermal mass performed. She scratched the numbers into the margin of the almanac with a pencil, checked them and scratched them again differently to make sure they still resolved the same way. They did. She wrote nothing down about the structure's purpose beyond the material calculations. She told no one. This was not evasion. It was a calculation of its own kind. The calculation of a woman in a community where being a widow and doing something no one had seen before meant that explanation rarely helped. Explanation gave people something to argue with. She did not have time for arguments. She had a structure to build before the first hard frost. She hired the Reimer brothers in the 3rd week of August. Jakob and Samuel Reimer were 16 and 19. The sons of a Mennonite farming family whose community had settled 8 miles to the east 4 years earlier. They were known in the wider community as reliable workers who charged fair rates and asked few questions, this last quality being the one that mattered most to Elsa. She met Samuel at the feed store in Huron and offered him work at a rate she paid partly in cash and partly in smoked pork and cornmeal, which the Reimer family could use directly. She told him she was expanding her root cellar substantially. He nodded and said he and his brother could come Thursday. They came Thursday. She had the site staked and the first line of sod scored. The brothers looked at the staked rectangle, 22 feet by 14 feet, and Samuel said it was a large root cellar. Elsa said she had a lot of vegetables. Jakob smiled at this and picked up a spade and began cutting sod, and that was the end of the conversation. They worked 4 days. The ground was harder than Samuel had estimated. The prairie sod of that latitude was not the familiar texture of a kitchen garden. It was a dense interlocked mat of root and clay and grass that had been building itself since before the first Europeans set foot on the continent. and each square foot of it weighed between 12 and 16 pounds and required sustained force to cut cleanly. The brothers cut and dug and hauled the displaced earth to the edge of the site, and by the end of the fourth day, they had excavated to a depth of 3.5 feet across the full rectangle. Elsa paid them, thanked them, watched them drive their wagon east, and picked up her own spade. She dug the remaining 2 feet herself, working from first light, until Clara and May came home from the schoolhouse 2 miles up the road, then working another hour while the girls did their lessons at the kitchen table through the window above her. She dug for 11 additional days. The final depth was 5.5 feet below the surface, which placed the floor of the chamber just below the frost line for that latitude and gave her the thermal stability the design required. The floor area, after accounting for wall thickness, was 18 feet by 12 feet, 216 square feet. Smaller than the frame house's main room, large enough. She lined the floor with flat stones from the creek, hauling them in the wheelbarrow through the dry grass of late summer, load after load, 41 loads in total, across 4 separate afternoons. Clara helped with the lighter stones, carrying them 2 at a time, pressed against her small chest, setting them down with the careful deliberateness of a child who understood she was part of something important without fully understanding what the important thing was. May brought water. On the second afternoon of hauling stone, May sat down in the grass beside the excavation and looked into it for a long time with the open, unguarded attention of a 5-year-old, and then said, "It's like a room that lives underground." Elsa stopped and looked at her younger daughter and said, "That's exactly what it is." She laid the stone floor twice. The first time she laid it, she noticed on the second morning that moisture had wicked up through the soil beneath the stones in several places, leaving dark patches on the rock surface. She pulled the stones up, spread a 2-inch layer of wood ash from the kitchen stove across the entire floor area, then laid an inch of coarse sand over the ash, then relaid the stones. The moisture did not come back. This was not in Astrid's drawing. It was something she worked out herself standing in the excavation in the late August heat, looking at the problem and thinking about what the water was doing and what would stop it. The ash and sand created a capillary break, a layer, that interrupted the path the moisture needed to travel. She noted this in the almanac margin next to the firewood calculation, because it was the kind of thing that mattered and that she did not want to lose. The walls went up through September. She used the sod blocks cut during the excavation, stacking them in the offset pattern Astrid had described. Each block shifted half its length from the one below. No 2 vertical seams aligned the same principle as brick construction, which distributes the load evenly and eliminates the weak vertical lines that can crack under pressure. She packed the gaps between blocks with loose soil and dried grass, pressing it in with her fingers. The walls rose 3 feet above grade, giving the structure an interior height of 8.5 feet at the center, enough to stand upright enough to feel like a room rather than a burrow. By the time Pastor Reinhardt came to see her on a Tuesday morning in early October, the walls were finished and she was working on the roof. He came on foot, his hat in his hands, his expression carrying the particular combination of care and apology that she had come to recognize as the community's way of delivering concern gently. He was a German-American man in his middle 50s, slight and precise in his movements, with the careful speech of someone who had learned English as an adult and still chose his words with the slight deliberateness of translation. He had a good heart. She had always believed this about him. He stood at the edge of the excavation site and looked at what she had built, and she could see him trying to understand it and arriving as everyone arrived at the wrong conclusion. He asked with genuine tenderness whether she had given any thought to the circuit pastor's arrangement. There was a family in Wisconsin, her husband's sister's household, people who had written to express their willingness to take her and the girls through the winter, perhaps longer. He said it was no failure to accept help. He said the Lord had given the community to us so that we did not have to face everything alone. Elsa thanked him. She told him she had thought about Wisconsin and had decided to stay. She said this without elaboration, without the defensiveness that elaboration would have required, without the explanation that would have given him something to argue with. She offered him a cup of coffee. He declined. He stood for another moment looking at the sod walls and the roof frame, and something moved behind his eyes, not understanding, but the beginning of a question he was not sure how to ask. Then he put his hat back on and said he would remember her family in his prayers, and walked back north toward the road. She watched him go and turned back to the roof poles. The roof went on through mid-October. Cottonwood poles cut from the stand along the creek, 8 feet long, spaced 8 inches apart across the full width of the structure, then covered with the tar paper she had driven to Huron to purchase for $11.60. A significant expenditure against a very thin margin, but a necessary one because the tar paper was the waterproof membrane that would keep the spring snowmelt from working through the 18 inches of packed sod she laid on top of it. The sod went on grass side down, so the roots grew back into the layer below and stitched the whole mass together. Once settled, it would not blow off, it would not burn, it would not crack. It would simply sit there, indifferent to whatever the sky decided to do. The entrance tunnel she built last, orienting it to the southeast as Astrid had specified, 4 feet wide and 4 feet long and 5 feet tall, requiring a person to duck slightly on entry. The tunnel served 2 functions simultaneously. It blocked the dominant northwest wind from having any direct path into the main chamber, and it created a thermal buffer, a passage of transitional air between the outside and the inside that partially warmed before reaching the living space, reducing the heat lost to the room each time the door opened. She hung oiled cloth across the inner mouth of the tunnel. The stove came from the Herman family, a small cast-iron box stove second-hand, bought for $4 from people who had given up their claim after 2 failed wheat harvests and were heading back to Ohio. It weighed 61 pounds. She and Clara moved it on a wooden sled, Elsa pulling Clara, guiding the back corner around the entrance tunnel's turn. The stove sat on a raised platform of flat stones in the northeast corner of the chamber, where the chimney could run at a slight diagonal through the roof, adding 18 inches of pipe length within the insulated sod layer. Every inch of that pipe in the warm zone transferred heat into the room rather than the sky. The clay collar around the pipe's exit through the roof took an afternoon to get right. She packed it, let it dry, packed it again, tested it with a small fire, found one side that breathed cold, and packed it a third time. The secondary storage chamber came next, connected to the main room by a low doorway, dug 6.5 feet below grade, rather than 5.5, running cooler closer to 40 degrees. Cold enough to prevent spoilage, warm enough to prevent freezing. Into it she put the provisions she had spent the summer preparing: 260 pounds of potatoes, 90 pounds of dried beans, 40 pounds of cornmeal, 68 quarts of preserved vegetables sealed in wax, 4 smoked hams, a 50-pound sack of flour. She had stocked it with the same deliberateness she had applied to the construction, stretching the available money across the categories of nutrition and caloric density, with the care of a person who understood that what she put into that room was not supplementary. It was the margin between endurance and collapse. 3 cords of split firewood, cottonwood, and ash, not the best fuel, but what was available, went against the south-facing wall above ground, covered with canvas tarpaulin weighted down with stones. She moved Clara and May into the chamber on the 15th of November. The frame house remained operational during the day. She was not ready to signal anything further to the community, but her daughters would sleep in the earth from now on. She built a small sod partition in the southern end for their sleeping area and hung additional oiled cloth over the entrance tunnel against drafts. The night she moved their beds down after the girls were settled, and the lamp was low and Clara was almost asleep. Her older daughter's voice came from the darkness. "Mama, are we safe down here?" Elsa sat on the edge of Clara's cot with the warmth of the stove on her left side and the cool of the earth wall on her right, and thought about what the honest answer to that question was. She thought about the 3 cords of firewood stacked above about the 260 pounds of potatoes in the cold room about the stone floor that would hold its warmth for hours after the fire went to coals about Astrid's hands, drawing on the flour sack in a Minnesota kitchen, while a 12-year-old girl paid attention because she could feel how much it mattered. "We are as safe as a person can make another person," she said. And she meant it not as a comfort exactly, but as a fact. And Clara heard the difference and accepted it and went to sleep. Outside, the temperature dropped to 14 below zero before dawn. Inside, the stove burned steadily, and the walls held their heat, and the stone floor kept its warmth like a kept promise. And Elsa Brandt sat awake for another hour in the yellow lamplight, listening to her daughters breathe and watching the small even flame, and waited for whatever was coming. December in the Dakota territory did not arrive so much as it descended, a weight settling onto the land from above, pressing the color out of the grass and the warmth out of the soil surface, and the confidence out of the faces of people who had been telling themselves all autumn that they were ready. The sky in early December had a particular quality that experienced settlers had learned to read with something between respect and dread. A flat pewter hardness that diffused the light without softening it, that made the prairie look like a photograph of itself rather than the thing itself, dimensionless and cold, and absolutely indifferent to the small wooden structures scattered across it. Elsa had been living primarily underground for 3 weeks by the time the first serious cold came. The adjustment had been stranger than she expected, and not in the ways she had anticipated. She had expected the physical challenges, the low ceiling of the entrance tunnel, the smell of packed earth that was not unpleasant but was constant, the way sound behaved differently underground, flatter and closer. What she had not fully anticipated was what it did to her sense of time. Below the surface, without windows, the day had a different texture. Light came from the lamp and from the stove's iron door. When she left it cracked orange and shifting, and the hours moved differently, measured by the fire's hunger and the girl's rhythms rather than by the angle of light through glass. She found she slept more deeply than she had in years. The chamber performed exactly as the calculations had predicted. On the coldest nights of early December, when the outside temperature dropped to 18 below zero, and the frame house 30 yards away would have required a fire burning through the night to keep the interior above 40 degrees. The underground chamber held at 53 degrees, with the stove banked low burning, perhaps a third of what the frame house would have consumed for a less satisfactory result. Elsa checked the temperature each morning with the small thermometer she had hung on the east wall. A habit, not a necessity, but one that gave her data she intended to keep. She wrote the numbers in the almanac margin beside the firewood calculations, building a record. The cold snap lasted 9 days. Then it broke, and the temperature rose back to the low 20s, and across the territory families exhaled and restocked their firewood, and told each other that perhaps the worst of it was past. Elsa did not believe this. She had not believed it from the moment the temperature rose, because she understood what a mid-December warming in the northern plains could mean. Warmth in December was not relief. Warmth in December was loading. It was the atmosphere drawing moisture up from the south, pulling air north to meet what was waiting above Canada, building the conditions for something that would arrive later, and colder and heavier than what had just passed. She had learned this from experience, not from any almanac. The almanac confirmed it, but she had known it before she checked. She spent the warming period splitting additional firewood. Nathan Holt saw her at it one afternoon riding past on the road to the north section. He pulled up at the edge of the property without dismounting, watching her swing the maul with the steady economical rhythm of someone who had been doing it long enough that the body had optimized the motion. He was 17, Nathan Holt, and he had the confidence of a boy who had been told enough times that he was capable, that he had begun to accept it as a complete description of himself. He looked at the firewood stacked against the wall above the chamber entrance and said, "That's a lot of wood for one woman and 2 little girls." Elsa drove the maul through a length of ash and set the 2 halves aside and looked at him. She said, "It's exactly the right amount of wood." Not defiant, not sharp, the tone of a person stating a measurement. Nathan looked at her for another moment with the expression of someone who suspects they have been corrected but cannot identify precisely how. Then he touched his hat brim and rode on. She split for another 2 hours. It was Dorothy Holt who changed the shape of what came next, though she did it so quietly that no one in the community knew it had happened until the consequences arrived in January. Dorothy came on a Tuesday in the second week of December alone, walking the half-mile from the Holt farm on a morning when the temperature sat at a manageable 10 degrees and the sky was clear. She arrived at the entrance to the underground chamber while Elsa was inside checking the cold storage room and called down, "Elsa, it's Dorothy. May I come in?" Elsa brought her down. She watched her neighbor's face as Dorothy moved through the entrance tunnel and straightened up inside the main room. And she saw the precise moment when Dorothy's expectation, whatever grim or desperate thing she had imagined finding, met the reality of what was actually there. The swept stone floor, the even walls, the lamp hanging from a cottonwood pole driven into the ceiling sod, the two small beds in the partitioned southern corner, the stove burning at an even moderate rate, filling the room with a warmth that had none of the desperate scorching quality of a fire burning too hot in a frame house against a losing fight with the cold outside. The temperature in the room was 58 degrees. Dorothy had walked over from a house where Elsa guessed the main room was sitting at 45 at best. Dorothy stood in the center of the chamber for a long moment, saying nothing, turning slowly to take in the full circumference of the room. Then she crossed to the east wall and pressed her palm flat against it, the packed sod smooth from the careful work of September, the dried grass filling the seams. She held her palm there, feeling the temperature of the wall itself, not the air, the wall. The wall was 54 degrees. The outside air was 10. Dorothy took her hand away and stood with her arms at her sides, and her lips pressed together for a moment that stretched long enough that Elsa began to wonder whether she had made a mistake in letting her in. Then Dorothy said, her voice quiet and careful, "I told Thomas you were building something real. He said you were grieving." A pause, the weight of it deliberate. "He wasn't entirely wrong, I suppose. He just thought grief only moved in one direction." Elsa said nothing. She put water on the stove for coffee. They sat for 20 minutes. Dorothy asked practical questions: how deep the floor was, how long the stove burned per loading, whether the cold storage room held temperature consistently. She asked the questions of a person conducting an assessment, precise and unornamented. She did not ask why Elsa had built it, or whether she was all right, or whether she had reconsidered Wisconsin. Before she left, Dorothy paused at the mouth of the entrance tunnel and said without turning back, "If something happens, I'll remember the way down." And then she climbed out into the 10-degree morning and walked back across the frozen grass toward her own house. In the days that followed, as the warming continued, Dorothy Holt quietly mentioned what she had seen to two neighbors, not as gossip, not as alarm, but in the careful, factual way of a woman sharing information she thought others might need. She described the location of the entrance. She described the unlocked door. She said the temperature inside was what it was. She did not editorialize. She let the numbers do what numbers do when they are the right numbers in the right context. Elsa did not know this had happened until much later. What she did know the morning after Dorothy's visit was that she reached up and unhooked the latch from the chamber door and set it aside. From that day forward, the door was not locked. She could not have said precisely why she made this decision at that moment. She would have said, if pressed, that it was a practical choice about access in an emergency. But it was also something else, an acknowledgement that what she had built was not entirely hers, had never been intended to be entirely hers, and that the ground beneath it had been keeping its warmth for every living thing above it, long before she put a spade into it. The warming lasted 8 days. Then, on the morning of December the 23rd, Elsa woke to a quality of stillness she had only felt once before, the specific loaded stillness that precedes major weather, where the air seems to be holding its breath, and the birds have gone somewhere else entirely. She climbed out to check. The sky to the northwest had a color that sat between gray and green, a color that had no name in the standard vocabulary of weather description, a color that Astrid had called the sky showing you its machinery. The temperature was 22 degrees, which was almost warm for late December in the territory. The wind was coming from the southwest. The wind in the territory came from the northwest. Southwest meant the pressure was falling, and the system drawing the air around it was large. She went back underground and told Clara and May they would not be attending Pastor Reinhardt's Christmas service. Clara, who had been anticipating this for 2 weeks, pressed her mouth into the thin line that meant she was unhappy, but had learned to process unhappiness without performing it. May asked whether Jesus would mind. Elsa said she thought he would be understanding about weather. The storm that arrived on Christmas Eve was significant. 3 days of sustained cold at -15, with wind driving snow horizontally and 4-foot drifts along every fence line, but it was not the storm. Elsa knew this because it ended cleanly, because the sky after it was the clear, high-pressure blue of a system that had completed its work, and because the temperature dropped to -22 in its aftermath, and then after 4 days rose again, rose past zero, rose to 18 degrees above zero, kept rising. She went to see Thomas Holt on the second day of the warming. She found him in his barn checking his cattle, which had weathered the Christmas storm in reasonable shape, though 2 of them were showing the dullness around the eyes. That meant they had been colder than was good for them. Thomas straightened up when she entered and looked at her, with the expression he always wore around her. Now wary care, the look of a man who has been gentle with someone for 6 months and is not certain his gentleness has been helpful. She told him directly. She said she believed a large storm was building, larger than what had just passed, and that it would arrive within the week, and that he should consider whether his firewood supply was adequate, and whether his family had a plan if the temperature inside the house dropped to an unsafe level. She gave him the information as information, the way one neighbor gives another a warning about a fence line or a sick animal. Flat, specific, actionable. Thomas listened. She could see him weighing it, not dismissing it, but running it against what he knew, against his own read of the weather, against the assessment of the men he trusted. He said the Christmas storm had been hard, but the animals had come through and the house had held temperature well enough. He said he had 2 cords of wood remaining, typically sufficient for January and February combined. He said he appreciated her concern. The specific quality of his appreciation told her everything she needed to know. It was the appreciation of a man who does not intend to change his plans. She thanked him for his time and walked back across the frozen fields. And that evening she went through her firewood inventory once more, and the numbers were the numbers she expected them to be, and she closed the almanac and did not open it again that night. She was not angry at Thomas Holt. She was not angry at any of them. What she felt sitting in the lamplight with the stove burning steadily and her daughters asleep behind the sod partition was something closer to the particular sadness of having information that other people cannot yet receive. Not because they are incapable, but because the information requires a context they have not had reason to build. You cannot hand someone the conclusion without the years that made the conclusion legible. And there was no time now for years. She did what she could do. She verified that the oiled cloth over the tunnel entrance was hanging straight and sealing the gap at the bottom. She added more wood to the covered stack by lantern light, while the temperature sat at the false warmth of 25 degrees. She banked the stove for the night with a careful loading of ash wood that would burn slow and steady until morning. Then she lay down beside May, who had migrated from her own cot in the night, as she sometimes did, and she thought about the ground's patience, its absolute long-practiced indifference to whatever happened at the surface. And she thought, the earth has been holding this warmth since summer. It has been waiting. It keeps its temperature just the same, whether or not anyone is down here to need it. She slept. On the morning of January 4th, she woke at 4 in the morning without knowing why. She lay still for a moment, cataloging what had come through her sleep. The stove was low, but not cold. The chamber temperature was around 50 degrees. May was breathing beside her in the even rhythm of deep sleep. The wind was different, not louder, but different in frequency, a lower register, a bass note under the usual treble of winter wind, a sound that suggested the wind was moving a very large amount of air rather than a fast amount of it. The distinction was the difference between a river running fast in a narrow channel and the river running over its banks. The second was slower in places and vastly more powerful and stopped for nothing. She got up, put on both coats and Heinrich's wool trousers over her own, and climbed through the entrance tunnel. The outside air hit her not like cold exactly, but like pressure, a sustained force from the northwest that leaned against her and kept leaning steady and patient, the way a large animal leans against a fence. The sky to the northwest had the color with no name. The temperature was -4 degrees and falling. The wind had been southwest the previous evening. It was northwest now. She stood outside for 90 seconds. That was enough. Back inside, she woke Clara first, then May. She told them to put on their warmest things and their boots. She stoked the stove with a full loading of ash and cottonwood, the densest combination she had. And she set water to heat, and she made the girls eat a full breakfast of cornmeal porridge with a piece of smoked ham cut thin across it. More food than their usual morning, because she did not know precisely when the next calm moment would arrive, and she was not going to leave anything to chance. Clara ate without speaking, watching her mother's face with the specific watchfulness that children develop when they understand that the adults around them are managing something serious. At 8 years old, Clara Brandt had already learned to read the difference between her mother worried and her mother prepared. And she had learned, though no one had taught her this in words, that prepared was the better of the two to see. She finished her porridge and cleaned her bowl and said, "Is it coming today?" Elsa checked the thermometer. -7. It had dropped 3 degrees in the time it had taken them to eat breakfast. "It's already here," she said. "It just hasn't arrived yet." The snow began at dusk. By the time full dark settled, the wind had reached 30 miles per hour, sustained with gusts audible even below the surface. Not as sound exactly, but as a rhythmic pressure change in the air of the chamber. A slight flex in the atmosphere that the earth above absorbed and passed on as information. The temperature outside had dropped to -14. Inside the chamber, the stove burning at a moderate rate held the temperature at 54 degrees. She sat at the small table with the almanac open and did the arithmetic one more time, not because she had forgotten the numbers, but because doing the calculation was a form of steadiness, a way of putting her hands on something solid when everything above her head was becoming unsteady. Firewood remaining approximately 2.5 cords. Burn rate at current temperature, with current occupancy roughly 1.5 armloads per day. At that rate, the remaining wood would last just over 3 months, more than adequate for the rest of winter, for her and the girls. She thought about Thomas Holt and his 2 cords of wood, and his frame house facing northwest, and his 7-week-old baby, whose name she did not yet know, because the birth had been difficult and the family had been keeping to themselves. She thought about Dorothy's chest, which troubled her in normal winters. She thought about the specific calculation that 2 cords represented in an uninsulated frame house against -20 degrees and 40-mile-per-hour wind. She closed the almanac. She looked at the walls, the careful solid walls that held their temperature, like a kept promise, and she thought about what they could hold. The floor was 216 square feet. The cold storage room had enough food to sustain more people than she had planned for if they were careful, if she rationed. She had not planned for 31 people. She had planned for 3. But she had built with enough margin that the difference between 3 and 30 was less absolute than it might have been. And she had built with the specific knowledge that in a hard winter on the Dakota prairie, a structure like this did not belong to the person who built it. It belonged to whoever needed it. Outside, the wind was climbing. The frame house 30 yards away was taking it on all 4 sides. The Holt barn was taking it. The small, careful Lutheran church 4 miles north was taking it. And 40 miles to the south, a weather station in Huron was recording numbers that the instruments had not been asked to record before. The storm did not stop that night. It pressed down on the Dakota territory with a weight and duration that the territory had not produced in the memory of anyone living on it. And the structures that people had built above the surface of the earth took what it gave them and held where they could and failed where they could not. 3 barns within 12 miles collapsed under snow loads that had been calculated for lesser possibilities. Fence lines disappeared. Roads became invisible, then dangerous, then the reason that people who needed to be somewhere else were still where they were. In the underground chamber on the Brandt property, the temperature on the second night of the storm was 53 degrees. Elsa burned 1.5 armloads of wood across the full day, a fraction of what the frame house would have required to achieve half the result. She cooked porridge on the stove and warmed water for washing, and listened to the storm deliver its verdict on everything that had been built above ground in the Dakota territory, on the assumption that above ground was enough. May slept. Clara lay on her cot and listened to the muffled force of the world above and said nothing, which was its own form of trust. The storm ended on the morning of January 7th, not gradually, not with the slow tapering that most weather produces. This one stopped with an abruptness that felt almost deliberate, as though whatever had been driving it had simply finished its work and withdrawn. 1 hour the wind was still shaking the world above the chamber's sod roof. The next hour there was silence so complete that Elsa could hear the lamp flame move. She dressed in everything she owned that was warm, both coats layered. Heinrich's wool trousers, the scarf Clara had made her 2 Christmases ago with the uneven stitching she had never fixed, because the unevenness was the point. She climbed through the entrance tunnel into a light so sharp and white. It was briefly painful, the particular light of a clear sky after heavy snow where every surface reflects and the eye has nowhere to rest that is not bright. The world had been reconfigured. The snow lay 3 feet deep on the flat and considerably deeper where it had met any obstacle. The frame house 30 yards south was standing. The roof had held the woodpile cover, had held on 3 or 4 corners. The well cover was visible above the drift on its east side. The structure was intact. She registered this with the specific relief of a person checking items off a list and moving to the next one. She looked west toward the Holt property, 1/2 mile across open ground. She could see the Holt barn and the Holt house both standing, and she could see the chimney of the Holt house against the sky, and she could see that there was no smoke coming from it. No smoke meant no fire. No fire at -24 degrees meant something that required no interpretation. She went back down into the chamber. Clara was awake, sitting on the edge of her cot, with her boots already on, watching the tunnel entrance with the expression of a child who had been listening to the silence and drawing the same conclusions her mother had. May was still asleep. Elsa told Clara she was going to the Holts, keep the stove at its current level, not higher. Wake May when she was hungry. Give her cornmeal from the pot at the back of the stove. Do not come above ground for any reason until Elsa came back or sent someone ahead. Clara listened to all of this and then said, "Bring them back." Not a question. An instruction delivered with the complete confidence of someone who has decided what the right outcome is and sees no reason to frame it any other way. Elsa looked at her daughter for a moment and felt something move in her chest that had no clean name, something compounded of grief and pride, and the specific tenderness of recognizing in a child's face a quality of mind the child had not been born with, but had built from the materials the world had handed her without her consent. "I will," she said, and meant it as a promise rather than a prediction, and went out through the tunnel into the -24 morning. The snow came to her thighs in the drifted sections. She moved through it with the steady, energy-conserving rhythm of someone who understands that continuous forward motion matters more than speed when the distance is 1/2 mile and the temperature is what it is. She found the Holt property fence by feel running her hand along the top of the drift until the post cap touched her palm, and followed it to the gate and crossed the yard to the front door. Thomas Holt opened the door before she knocked. He had been awake. That was clear from his face, the hollow, reddened look of a man who has spent the night on the wrong side of a calculation he did not know he was making until it was too late to revise. The interior of the house behind him was dim and cold in the specific way of a space that has been losing heat steadily for hours where the cold has settled into the furniture and the walls and the air itself and sits there with a permanence that a single fire cannot quickly reverse. The thermometer on the Holt kitchen wall read 38 degrees. His last dry wood had gone into the stove 3 hours before dawn. The cord and a half stacked outside had been buried under the storm's drift and was now a frozen mass, the individual pieces locked together by ice. His axe could not split it. His hands could not separate it. Dorothy's chest had been tightening since the second night of the storm, and her breathing had a quality that Thomas described with the careful understatement of a man who is very frightened and managing the fear by being precise. It had a quality, he said, that he did not like. The baby, her name was Ruth. He said they had named her Ruth, 7 weeks old, was in Dorothy's arms under every blanket they owned. Elsa did not explain anything. She told Thomas to bring his family and that her neighbors knew the way. Thomas Holt got his family moving. Dorothy wrapped in every blanket that could be carried. The baby Ruth tucked against Dorothy's chest inside the outermost layer, Nathan carrying the 6-year-old on his back. The two middle children walking with the particular grim competence of frontier children who have been told that this is necessary and have accepted it. They crossed the half-mile in 20 minutes. Elsa got them down into the chamber and got Dorothy onto the better of the two cots and got the baby Ruth unwrapped enough to check her color, which was pink and healthy, and adjusted the stove upward slightly to account for the additional bodies now occupying the space. Then she looked at Thomas and said, "The Brennans are south. Can you make it south?" Thomas Holt was a man who had spent the previous night convinced he had made a fatal error of judgment, who had stood in a cooling house in the dark and understood what his confidence in his own preparation had cost his family, and who was now standing in a room that was 56 degrees at -24 outside, and holding a room built by a widow with a spade and $4 worth of second-hand cast iron. The full weight of that understanding was visible in his face. He said, "I'll make it south," and he meant it the way Elsa had meant her promise to Clara, not as a prediction, but as a commitment coming from a place below ordinary intention. He went south, Elsa went north. Pastor Reinhardt's house was 1.25 miles north on the road. He answered the door in his coat, which he had apparently not removed for the duration of the storm, and behind him, Ruth Vent, 68 years old. His housekeeper, a woman of remarkable toughness who had survived 4 decades of Dakota winters, through sheer refusal to acknowledge their authority, was sitting in a chair beside a stove that was barely warm, the wood nearly gone wrapped in a quilt, still shivering. She looked at Elsa in the doorway and said with the directness of someone who has moved past the point where social formulation serves any purpose, "I haven't been warm in 2 days. I would very much like to be warm." Elsa brought them both. The Lindqvist family arrived on their own, which was the development that clarified something Elsa had not been entirely certain of until that moment. Carl Lindqvist came across the field from the northeast with his wife and 3 children. And when Elsa met them at the entrance to the tunnel and asked how they had known to come, Carl said that his wife had heard from Dorothy Holt in December that the chamber door was not locked, that it was there if needed, and that Dorothy had described exactly where the entrance was and how to find it in snow. His youngest, a boy of 3 named Peter, had been cold for too long. Not hypothermic in the clinical sense, but close enough that when Elsa got him inside and near the stove, she could feel the chill in his small hands through his mittens, a deep cold that had worked its way past the surface. She sat with Peter Lindqvist for 20 minutes, holding his hands between hers near the stove, watching the color come back into his face with the patient attention of someone who understands that this is the work, that this specific act of one person's warmth moving into another person's cold is the entire point of everything she had built and planned and been told was wrong. His mother sat on the floor beside them with her hand on the boy's back and did not try to speak and did not need to. By the afternoon of January 7th, the chamber held 9 adults and several children, with more arriving through the remainder of that day and into the following morning. 2 additional families came on January 8th, drawn by the chain of information that moved through the Brennan and Lindqvist households as Thomas carried word south and Carl carried it east. The total reached 31 people over the course of those 2 days. 7 families from a 12-mile radius, each arrival traceable through a chain of cause and effect that ran back ultimately to one source, Dorothy Holt, pressing her palm against a sod wall in December, memorizing the temperature and choosing to tell 2 neighbors what she had found. The chamber was not comfortable in the way a proper house is comfortable. There were not enough chairs for the adults and not enough floor space for the children to move freely. The single stove worked harder, with 31 people breathing in the space. But 31 people also generated heat in amounts that Elsa had calculated in the abstract and was now measuring in practice 9 adults producing roughly 350 BTU per hour each, which in a 216 square foot insulated underground space contributed meaningfully to the thermal budget. She reduced the stove's output accordingly, adding wood less frequently, keeping the burn moderate and steady. The temperature with the full complement of people and a careful fire settled between 58 and 64 degrees depending on the hour. Dorothy Holt's breathing improved within 48 hours of arriving in the warm room. By the 3rd day, the frightening quality Thomas had described was gone, entirely replaced by the even unlabored rhythm of a woman who has simply been cold and is no longer cold. She took over the morning porridge cooking, freeing Elsa's attention for the resource management that no one else in the chamber had the numbers for. Nathan Holt, the boy who had looked into the entrance tunnel 2 months ago and said it looked like a grave rose every morning before the others, and split the day's wood from the covered stack above, carrying it down without being asked, without comment, in the quiet way of someone who has decided that a debt exists and has chosen the currency in which to repay it. It was on the 3rd day that Pastor Reinhardt took off his coat. He had kept it on since arriving. Not because he was cold, the room was warm enough, but because he had put it on 2 days before the storm, and had not found a moment in the intervening time when removing it seemed right. On the 3rd day, he sat in the corner on a stool that Nathan had carried down from the surface, and he looked around the room. The careful sod walls, the swept stone floor, the stovepipe running clean, the cold storage room stocked with counted rationed food, and he looked at it the way a man looks at something he has misread and is now reading correctly for the first time. 3 months ago he had stood above this site and seen the excavation of a desperate woman. He was sitting inside the most competent structure in a 12-mile radius. He folded his coat across his knees and held it there. Elsa saw it from across the room, where she was inventorying the potato supply. She saw it and understood what it meant, and went back to counting potatoes. Carl Lindqvist asked the question on the 8th day. He was sitting near the stove with a cup of coffee, watching Elsa update the firewood count in the almanac margin, and he said, "Where does a person learn to build something like this?" Elsa put down the pencil. She looked around the room, Dorothy breathing easily on the cot, baby Ruth making the small periodic sounds of an infant conducting the serious business of existing, Peter Lindqvist asleep on a folded blanket, with his face completely relaxed and his small hands curled under his chin, warm and entirely himself again. She had held those hands 2 days ago and felt the cold that had worked into them. She looked at what the warmth had done. She told them about Astrid Halverson. She told it the way Astrid had taught her things, without decoration, with the specific technical and personal details that gave it its weight. The flour sack drawing and the cross-section of the earth, and the temperature at 6 feet below the surface, and why the entrance faced southeast, and why the stovepipe ran diagonal through the insulated sod, and what the stone floor was doing that packed earth could not do as reliably. She had not planned to say any of it in front of a room. She had planned to answer Carl's question and continue with the inventory. But the room was small, and the people in it were not otherwise occupied. And by the time she was describing the capillary break under the stone floor, Carl was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, and Thomas Holt had turned from the wall he had been facing, and Pastor Reinhardt was listening with the focused attention of a man who is revising something in his understanding as the new information arrives. She was not telling it for recognition. She was telling it because she looked at 31 people in a room that had kept them alive through the worst weather the territory had ever produced, and she understood that the knowledge she was holding was not something a person had the right to keep. Astrid had given it to a 12-year-old girl because she understood this. Elsa was giving it now for the same reason. Thomas Holt spoke when she finished. He did not look at her directly. He looked at the sod wall to his left, the wall his wife was sitting beside, breathing easily in a room that was 60 degrees while -20 pressed down on the world above. He said, "I should have listened to you in January." A pause and then lower. "I should have listened in November." Elsa was quiet for a moment. She said, "You're listening now. That's what matters for next time." The 11 days the community spent in the underground chamber rearranged quietly and permanently the way those families understood the relationship between a human being and the ground beneath their feet. Not through argument, not through persuasion, but through the direct, unavoidable experience of being warm when every other option had failed. You cannot argue with 60 degrees when the world outside is -24. You can only be grateful for it and wonder what you missed and begin to think about what you would do differently. The baby Ruth gained weight during those 11 days. She was 7 weeks old at the start of the storm, born into a hard winter, to a mother who had been cold and exhausted and frightened. In the underground chamber on the Brandt property with Dorothy warm and fed, and no longer frightened, Ruth Holt gained weight because her mother could nurse without difficulty, and an infant who is nursed without difficulty gains weight. The chain of causation ran from the stone floor to the sod walls, to the thermal mass, to the temperature, to the mother, to the milk, to the child. And at no point in that chain was there any element that Astrid Halverson had not understood and drawn on the back of a flour sack in a Minnesota kitchen 30 years before. The correspondent from the Huron Daily Plainsman arrived on a Wednesday in February 3 weeks after the roads had been cleared enough for a horse and rider to make 12 miles without serious risk. He was a young man with the earnest, forward-leaning manner of someone who understood he was in the presence of something worth describing accurately and was determined not to miss the significant details. He asked questions for 2 hours, sitting at the small table in the chamber with his notebook open, and she answered them with the same directness she had applied to everything: dimensions, materials, costs, construction sequence, thermal performance, occupancy during the storm outcomes. The floor was 18 by 12 feet. The stove had cost $4. 31 people had sheltered here through the worst weather in the territory's recorded history. The temperature inside had not dropped below 53 degrees during the 61 hours of the storm's peak. The baby had gained weight. He wrote all of it down. The piece ran on page 3 and was picked up by 2 other territorial papers. And in the autumn of 1887, several families in the region attempted to build similar structures following the description in print. Most of them succeeded well enough. The principles were sound enough to survive imperfect execution, which is what most first attempts produce. None of them built it quite the way Elsa had, because none of them had the years of understanding that made the difference between a structure that performed and a structure that merely existed. But the knowledge was in the ground now, in the community's knowledge, in the way people talked about winter and preparation and what the earth could do. Nathan Holt built his own chamber in the autumn of 1891. He was 22 with his own claim 4 miles north of his father's property, and a young wife named Catherine, who was making her first acquaintance with the Dakota winter. He built it smaller, 14 by 10 feet, and he built the entrance tunnel 6 inches too short, which reduced the thermal buffering slightly, a flaw he corrected in the second year, when he extended it to the proper length. He had been present for Elsa's explanation on the 8th day in the chamber. He had listened the way she had hoped someone would listen, with the specific active attention that turns information into understanding. He got most of it right. He never called anything a grave again. Elsa remained on the Brandt property. She did not go east. She planted winter wheat in the autumn of 1887 and hired a neighbor's son for the harvest, and the harvest was sufficient. And in 1888, she paid off the remaining balance on the plow mortgage and drew a line through the amount in the almanac with a deliberateness that contained more satisfaction than she chose to express out loud. In 1889, when the Dakota Territory was divided and admitted as two separate states, the county land records listed Elsa Brandt as a property owner, in good standing claim, intact, no encumbrances. The underground chamber stood for 12 more years. It served as cold storage and root cellar through the mild winters and in the hard winters of 1893 and 1897. It served as emergency shelter again, though by then the community's relationship to it had changed completely. In 1886, it had been the excavation of a woman the community had written off. By 1893, it was a known resource, a designated point of safety, a place people had on their mental maps of the territory, the way they had the church and the feed store and the physician in Huron. They came on their own in those later winters. No one needed to be carried there or talked into it. They simply came and it received them and it kept them warm. In 1899, Elsa had a carpenter extend the entrance tunnel to 8 feet, improving the thermal performance of the airlock beyond what the original 4-foot length had achieved. And she had him hang a proper wooden door at the inner end with a good iron latch. She planted climbing roses along the south-facing wall of the structure above grade that spring, a red-flowered variety hardy to zone, for their roots protected by the warmest ground on the property. They bloomed every June reliably and abundantly for as long as she was alive to see them. A wild red flowering over the sod roof that struck every visitor who saw it for the first time as incongruous, and then after a moment's thought as exactly right. The most alive thing on the property, rooted in the warmest ground, blooming above the place that had kept 31 people breathing through the worst night the territory had ever produced. Clara married in 1899, the same year the roses went in, a farmer from 2 counties north. She had 4 children and told them the story of the winter of 1887. The way Elsa had told her, not as legend, not as heroism, but as practical history, as an account of what a person had built and why and what it had done with the specific details preserved, because the specific details were the point. May became a school teacher, moved to Rapid City, and lived until 1951. She described the underground chamber to her students once in a lesson about the difference between knowledge and belief. And a student asked how a person could know whether what they believed was actually true. May thought about her mother's hands on the almanac at 4 in the morning, and about Peter Lindqvist's hands warming between those same hands near the stove, and she said, "You build it and you see what it holds." Elsa never spoke publicly about what Astrid Halverson had taught her, beyond the interview with the Plainsman correspondent. She gave no lectures. She submitted no letters to agricultural journals. The knowledge was available to anyone who came and looked and asked the right questions, and several people did. And she answered them fully and precisely the way Astrid had answered her. She did not seek the larger audience. The larger audience was not the point. The point was something older than an audience. The point was a woman in a kitchen drawing on a flour sack, because she understood that what she carried was not hers alone to keep that knowledge, which saves lives, belongs to whoever needs it next, and that the only real way to honor it is to find someone willing to receive it and give it to them completely, without holding anything back for the sake of your own importance. There was a late afternoon in June, years after the storm, when Elsa sat at the entrance to the chamber in the long summer light with Clara beside her, and the roses in full bloom over the sod roof, red against the wide Dakota sky. Clara asked her to tell it again, the whole story from Astrid at the kitchen table to the morning after the storm. Elsa looked at her daughter's face, which had her father's cheekbones and her own eyes, and the particular expression of someone who is asking, not because they have forgotten, but because they want to hear it, said aloud one more time, want to feel the weight and shape of it in the air between 2 people who both know it is true. Elsa reached into her apron pocket and found the folded piece of paper she had put there that morning. Alongside the pencil, she always kept a habit of pockets, of always carrying what might be needed. She unfolded it on her knee and smoothed it flat and began to draw. The cross-section, the earth layers, the temperature line at 6 feet. The principle that Astrid had explained to a 12-year-old in a Minnesota kitchen, as though the 12-year-old's attention was the most important thing in the room, as though what was being passed between them was too valuable to risk on anything less than perfect care from both sides of the transfer. Clara leaned in and watched the drawing take shape. The roses moved in the evening wind above them. The ground beneath the chamber at the depth where temperature did not follow the weather held its steady warmth exactly as it always had, as it always would. Storing what the summer gave it and releasing it back through the long, cold, dark, patient and deep and indifferent to whatever the sky chose to do. The earth did not forget what it knew, neither, it turned out, did she.